Okay? Yeah, okay. So, well, we very much like to welcome Professor Gareth Jones this morning, who's come all the way from New Zealand, from the University of Otago, to speak to us, but also, I'm happy to say, to do other few things, like go to a wedding and various other things while he's here in England. Professor Gareth Jones is the Deputy Vice-Chancellor in the University of Otago in New Zealand. He's also Professor in the Department of Anatomy there. Originally came from this country and studied at University College in London, and then emigrated out to Australia and then New Zealand from 1970 onwards. And he's written extremely widely on ethics and brain science, on genetic engineering, on cloning, and you'll find, I'm sure, some of his books out there on the bookstall, so I do recommend those to you. And he's also been involved in the whole sort of science and religion debate now for many years. So he's going to talk to us genetics, plasticity, and personhood, the brain in the 21st century. So thank you very much, Professor Jones.
Well, thank you very much, Dennis. People seem to think that these climates are rather warm. Well, I have to admit, tomorrow I'm going to a climate probably about 5 degrees, but as you heard, I did spend actually quite a number of years in Perth in Western Australia, where it was rather hotter than this. Anyway, we are dealing with rather different matters this morning. You can see the title, and I believe a full sort of handout will be coming around to you very shortly of this lecture and also the next one. Now, contemporary neuroscience is replete with techniques and approaches that make the old distinctions between brain, mind, and soul appear at best quaint and at worst a hindrance to understanding the human condition. Take neuroimaging, the world of functional magnetic resonance imaging. It has the potential to decode an individual's conscious experience based solely on non-invasive measurements of their brain activity. And this is what is becoming known as brain reading. And in the general literature, this is rapidly gaining enormous prominence because of its apparent ability to be used as a means of detecting deception. But of course, that's just the tip of the iceberg, because underlying this ability is the premise that our innermost secret thoughts and feelings are located in our brains, and that they can be investigated by external observers. And so we have the growth of things like neuromarketing, neuroeconomics, neurotechnology, and neuroenhancement, and those are just a few. And it's hardly surprising then that these burgeoning areas are causing concern within societies. And the result is that neuroethics is in the early stages of becoming recognized as a sub-area within bioethics. But where does this leave traditional Christian or more general religious conceptions? What has happened to the soul or the heart, both of which still feature prominently in much Christian language and thinking? How often do you hear theologians referring to the brain, let alone ever hear it mentioned in church services? What's the relationship then between the brain and the human person in our understandings? And what is the relationship of the brain and the person in Christian and other religious thinking? Or is the rise of neuroscience an embarrassment to Christian understandings of the human person? Now, Joel Green is a New Testament scholar who is aware of these issues, and he's attempting to take serious account of neuroscientific findings in his writings on the soul, the mind, and the brain. But he is representative of a very, very small number of theologians. And where do Christians and others think that human choices originate? Now, I've no doubt that there'll be many answers to this question from a host of different Christian and other religious traditions. But any answers that pay scant attention to the brain are about to come into major conflict with neuroscience. And the same applies to those Christians who refuse to face up to the deeply physical nature of our behaviors and our responses. And so whether the findings of contemporary neuroscience pose a threat to Christian belief comes down, I think, to the role that we do or do not give to the brain in helping form our view of the human person. Now, to what extent, then, is it possible to decode mental states from brain activity in humans? That was the task undertaken by John Dylan Haynes and Geraint Rhys in a review of human neuroimaging in the July 2006 issue of Nature Review's Neuroscience. And they asked the question, is it possible to tell what someone is currently thinking based only on measurements of their brain activity? Now, that particular review is a detailed analysis of a whole lot of methodological considerations. And they conclude by stating, and I quote, "Decoding-based approaches show great promise in providing new empirical methods for predicting cognitive or perceptual states from brain activity." Now, in some ways, that might be a rather dry conclusion, and the sort of methods don't concern us at all. But it points in the direction of being able to predict behavior from neuroimaging data. And that raises a huge number, of course, of ethical concerns. Now, the existing literature points towards the ability to detect the neural correlates of an increasingly wide array of conditions and traits. And the sorts of things that you find debated quite a bit in the literature these days are things like being able to detect from neuroimaging things like conscious and unconscious racial attitudes, conscious self-regulation of emotion, various personality traits, various personality disorders and psychopathic conditions, various serious criminal tendencies, drug abuse such as cocaine craving, or preferences for products such as well-known drinks. And also, it might give clues to the decision-making process itself. Now, all of these in their different ways are illustrations of what people are more and more talking about as brain reading. Now, while I think there's no doubt they raise issues of vast significance for society, because some of them, of course, are highly controversial. But surely they also confront Christians and those with any religious perspective with the centrality of the brain in any model that they construct of the human person. Let me just give you one or two examples, and speaking initially, say, from a Christian perspective. But one imagines it might be possible to pinpoint the parts of someone's brain that are active when that individual initially makes the crucial decision to become a follower of Jesus Christ. Also, what about any subsequent moral and spiritual choices? We might be able to detect what parts of the brain are active when we forgive rather than hold grudges against other people, or when we decide to put others first by serving them. Same comments would probably apply, say, to the act of praying. It might even be suggested that different types of prayer would be associated with different brain regions. Now, obviously, this is highly speculative, and one may well ask whether it's even profitable speculation. But my point remains, and it's the point that I'm trying to get over. We should not be surprised to find neural correlates with what we consider are fundamental activities characteristic of any religious community. And by the same token, we will never find equivalent correlates in any other organ, no matter how central some of them, like the heart, have been considered to be in, let us say, Christian theology. Now, of course, the simple act of finding correlates for certain behaviors or attitudes is irrelevant when it comes to talking about causative factors, simply because brain region R is active when behavior B is undertaken doesn't mean that changes in R cause B to take place. After all, the opposite could be the case. in that when an individual displays behavior B, brain region R is modified. And if this occurs sufficiently often, then there are significant changes to brain region R. Or it might be argued the interplay between R and B is so close that the only tenable conclusions we can reach is that there is no definitive causative factor because the one feeds upon the other. That's fine, but I think we've got to start digging deeper. Because the sort of neural correlates detectable by functional MRI are themselves indicators of things like cellular changes, like changes in neurotransmitter substances. Let me give you an example. Last year, a paper appeared in the Journal of Neurophysiology, and in it, the authors asserted that romantic love is a biological urge distinct from sexual arousal. Now, what they had done was to use functional MRI, and they postulated that the neural profile of romantic love is more like a physical craving than it is like an emotional state. And they used as their guinea pigs, if you like, college students who were said to be in the early stages of new love. Not quite sure how they defined that, but anyway, that's what they said. And what they found in these students was that the active brain areas were regions like the caudate nucleus, which produces the neurotransmitter dopamine, and which appears to be involved when people desire or anticipate a reward. And even more fascinating was the observation that this region was on the opposite side of the brain from another area concerned with physical attractiveness. But surely we may say, oh, let's forget about all that nonsense. Surely romantic love is more than the product of neurotransmitters and neurons. Isn't this denigrating all we hold dear? Can we really dismiss Shakespeare's sonnets as nothing more than neuroscientific fantasies? And from here, of course, it's but a short step to dismissing even religious aspirations as nothing more than the outpouring of one neurotransmitter or another. One could argue that people with certain levels of dopamine in region X have religious sentiments, whereas those with lower levels have no need of religious symbolism. One could argue it's all a matter of neural organization, and in turn, that is simply an expression of genetic predisposition. And so what one could conclude is that what we need are neurotransmitters and not prayer. Now, all this might seem like a rerun of the old neural determinism argument in modern guise. And of course, any brief comments I've made apply here about causation as well. But I think the point that I really want to get home is that these days its basis is far less hypothetical than was once the case. After all, we are coming close to being able to use the growing armamentarium of neural technologies to do a whole variety of things. After all, if we can predict how someone will act under certain circumstances, then we have the ability to intrude upon their privacy, as well as to use the data to scope sophisticated marketing campaigns. That's why people are seriously talking now about neuromarketing. And the next step, though, would be to modify people's brains by using drugs that either increase or decrease the levels of chemicals like neurotransmitters in targeted brain regions. Now, those sorts of intrusions could be used for therapeutic or enhancement purposes, and I'll talk more about enhancement in my next talk. So they could be used then, say, for therapeutic purposes or to modify people's decision-making. And as with all technologies, there is ample room for every kind of use, possibly good uses, possibly very evil uses. But I'm not concerned here now with the ethical issues as much as with the underlying concepts. To what extent have people like Christians begun to come to grips with these developments? Because they have major pastoral implications as well as fundamental conceptual ones. And what I want to start is with some of the pastoral implications. Now, for a number of years, there have been a drive to to find drugs to improve the functioning of people's brains, to combat everything from things like depression and anxiety disorders through to stress and shyness, and even to things like forgetfulness and sleepiness. This is the world of what one ethicist has called the world of super Prozacs, in which almost every behavioral disorder becomes amenable to drug-based treatment. Consider the use of something like Prozac as an illustration of a class of drugs that affect the activity of a particular neurotransmitter, which in this case is serotonin. And the transmitters really don't concern us as such here, but it's just that neurotransmitters are involved. Now, these particular drugs generally act in the emotional centers of the brain, and so they influence emotional responses, either to make people more outgoing and to combat depression and anxiety disorders. The question, though, that I want to ask is whether this might have relevance in the lives of, let us say, certain Christians or other religious people. I'll use just one or two Christians as an illustration. Now, I think it is relevant. Let me give you two examples. Jane wanted to die in spite of concerted prayer and counseling. After taking Prozac, she began to feel normal, and she could experience God in ways previously unknown to her. Trevor's life was dominated by severe depression and outbursts of anger. Following a number of weeks on Prozac, he was transformed, and he felt just as he had years previously when he became a Christian. Now, for people like Jane and Trevor, medication is a fact of life, and it allows them to experience normality with all its highs and lows. So I think this suggests that even people who are deeply committed to God may have no hope of a normal life without this sort of assistance. Now, of course, for some people, this is profoundly disturbing. And to put it provocatively, we can ask the question, can a pill do what normally we think, and our Christians think, only the Holy Spirit can do? Why do drugs work when prayer and counseling may have failed? Perhaps we should conclude that spiritual problems can be more effectively cured by neuroscience and psychology than by traditional spiritual means. Or at the very least, that traditional spiritual means should be complemented by neuroscience and psychology. I'm not trying to answer these questions here, but I think however we answer them, what we really have to recognize is there is an inextricable link between the biochemistry of the brain, who we are as persons, and how we relate to each other and to God. Certain brain regions are associated with certain functions like goal attainment and anxiety. And so emotional and mental health requires appropriate functioning of these sorts of brain regions and their myriad connections. There is then to some degree a neural basis for emotional well-being, and so when aberrations occur, the appropriate neural systems need to be targeted. And so in these terms, Prozac may allow an individual to achieve freedom from emotional dysfunction and specific psychological disorders, and so to enhance that individual's ability to build character. This becomes important for an individual whose actions stem not from understanding, but from compulsion, or as a means of dealing with feelings of guilt or failure. I think to the extent that the guilt or the failure emanate from emotional affliction, it is appropriate they are tackled in whatever way is best, and that might include the use of Prozac-like drugs. Now, Michael Boivin has commented, and I quote him, that the usefulness of Prozac results not because our experience of God is nothing more than a brain state, but because God created us as physical beings within which the brain serves as the final omnibus of our thoughts and emotions that are relevant to him. And so in these terms, then, it seems that Prozac can have a role in healing emotional afflictions, simply because we are persons who are part of God's physical creation, a creation that is maladaptive and in need of redemption. Prozac then, and similar drugs, may provide a limited means of redressing brain systems that have been warped by many forms of maladaptation, and which by itself may be one means of effecting at least short-term restoration. Now, of course, the assumption underlying these sorts of thoughts is that the use of Prozac and all similar drugs is to remedy a pathology within the brain. In other words, its intention is a therapeutic one, because the individual is ill. And so, to answer my earlier question, a pill may work because it is rectifying synaptic function and functioning connections that have gone wrong, just as a pill may work to correct malfunctioning heartbeat. And so my antithesis then of a pill or prayer is obviously unhelpful. Any drug regime should only be resorted to within a context provided by prayer and spiritual discernment. And this, of course, is where the Holy Spirit comes in determining the best course of action in intractable situations like the ones I've raised. We need to see the individual as a whole person, that is, a person in relation to God and also as a part of a community of faith. But of course there's a proviso, and this is that drug-based approaches to emotional illness constitute a direct means of modifying the brain and therefore the individual's responses. And of course, modifications like this are not without their dangers. And of course, they leave untouched social, community, and spiritual problems. And so I would certainly argue long-term solutions need to take account of this broader relational context within which the individual is seeking to live, because these indirectly influence neural and mental functioning. After all, we are all bodies with multifaceted dimensions, and with our brains as one of these facets. Now, I want to now try and sort of develop this a bit by looking at extreme situations. What can go wrong when the brain is seriously damaged? It's been known for a very long time indeed that damage to certain brain regions may have grotesque ramifications. And this is because our brains appear to make us the sort of people we are in a way in which things like our liver, kidneys, or pancreas don't make us the sort of people we are. In other words, there seems to be a much closer relationship between my brain and me than there is between my kidneys and me. Now, one doesn't have to look very far for some very well-known and tragic examples of catastrophic changes to individuals following brain damage. Let me give one well-known in the neuropsychology literature. Zazetsky was a young soldier who in 1943 was hit in the head by a bullet during the Russian offensive against the Germans in the Battle of Smolensk. His brain injury affected almost all facets of his existence. Initially, he was unable to perceive anything because his world had collapsed into quite literally fragments. He was unaware, for instance, of the existence of the right side of his body. He'd forgotten how to carry out the most mundane of tasks. He'd completely forgotten the name of all common objects. He became repeatedly lost, and he had become illiterate. In one sense, Zazetsky had been killed on that fateful day, because from this point onwards, his life became a living nightmare. By his own admission, he no longer considered himself to be a man, but a shadow, some creature that's fit for nothing. What I think is so striking about this tragic example was Zazetsky's determination to continue to be someone. He devoted the next 25 years to writing a 3,000-page document, which he then couldn't even read without enormous toil and perseverance. You see, in the midst of appalling limitations, his humanness shone through. And you see, his determination to gain meaning for his dauntingly limited existence dominated everything. And this was only made possible for him by the writing of this journal. Because in the journal, he revived the past in an attempt, as he said, to ensure a future. It was his reason for living. Writing became his only way of thinking. And of course, he succeeded, but he also failed. There was no ultimate way out for him, because his mental stagnation could never be dispelled. but the one or two remaining faculties he had afforded him some respite from a world otherwise lacking in meaning and coherence. Now, of course, Zetsky's nightmare was extreme, but of course there are many others have suffered similar fates, and each one in its own way illustrates the human plight of living with a devastated center of personhood. Now, quite a different example, the one you've got just here on the screen, and much closer to the present day. This man that you can see there is a builder and a heroin addict. He was transformed into an obsessive artist following a cerebral hemorrhage. He had never looked at art before. He was not interested in it. He certainly couldn't do any. What he had as a result of that cerebral hemorrhage, that is the blood escaping from some of the vessels supplying the brain, was that he had damage to the frontal lobes of his brain. And the result was he just manically paints, sculpts, and writes poetry. That's all he can do. He can't get away from doing these things. Activities, I said, which were completely foreign to him prior to his hemorrhage. Or one other, again, very recent example, there are now some examples coming to light of therapy-induced damage to the brain as a result of treating some patients, anyway, with Parkinson's disease with drugs that are what are known as dopamine enhancers. It doesn't matter about the details for us. But there's a suggestion that excessive levels of dopamine in the brain turns some of these patients into compulsive gamblers and obsessive pleasure seekers. So some of these patients with Parkinson's disease who would never ever have spent anything on gambling now simply spend everything imaginable on gambling as a result of this particular treatment. Now, there's no definitive evidence for this particular link, but it is emerging in a number of these patients. And it's not an unreasonable possibility because dopamine is associated with various addictive behaviors. Now, what I think is clear about these, and you could have numerous other pathological examples, is the relationship between injury to the brain and aberrant behavior. In other words, brain injury A is the direct cause of behavior, little a. And that relationship holds regardless of one's theological stance or one's moral values. Medication can act in a similar way by elevating or depressing the levels of certain neurotransmitters like dopamine. Question is, does this also apply to a healthy individual with a healthy brain and a normal behavioral repertoire? Now, great care, of course, has always got to be exercised in arguing from the abnormal to the normal. But I think it's difficult to escape the conclusion that everything from memories, emotions, and higher thought processes to motor functions and sensory awareness, they all have physical correlates in the brain. The only alternative is to postulate that they emanate from some non-physical source outside our bodies. But whatever one thinks of that, that does not add any explanatory value to neurological perspectives. The thing is, though, should we look for a non-physical cause of neurological conditions any more than we do in other organs? See, the fear that one generally hears on the part of some people is that it's tying us down to apparently mechanical explanations and thereby excluding any place for spiritual dimensions. Now, that's certainly not the intention, and it's not the end result. It would seem to me that if we operate within a God-centered framework, we're in a position to view these observations within that framework. And so the organization of the brain will be understood as an integral part of the human person, contributing to the God responsiveness of all who are made in the image of God. Now, I think as we just bear these sorts of considerations in mind, underlying them all, I think, is the dictum that if an individual's brain is changed, that individual may be changed, as if the machine of the core of our being had been adjusted. But if that is the case, what are the implications for our view of ourselves as beings of significance? Are we little more than neural machines writ large? I think these are very understandable concerns. But of course, they're based on a machine type of model that suggests not only vulnerability, but also fixity and rigidity. And I think that model is misleading. Not because it fails to do justice to religious aspirations, but to scientific ones. Because the brain is the very opposite of a machine, simply because it is highly responsive to numerous environmental stimuli at all stages of life. You see, the two-way interactions between an individual's brain and the worlds internal and external to that individual, they point to the richness of its multi-dimensional context. And so in no sense can the brain be isolated from an individual in the way in which the heart can be. Neither could it be replaced by another brain without destroying the integrity of the individual as the person that he or she is known to be. Now let's undertake a thought experiment. Now you might feel rather sorry for these four friends because they've all got big problems, but let's at least imagine them. Four friends. Paul has had a kidney transplant. Mark has had a heart transplant. Ruth has an artificial hip, and Crystal has a brain transplant. How might we respond to these four individuals, all of whom we know quite well? Now, we've got no problem in recognizing and relating to Paul, Mark, and Ruth, the ones with the kidney, heart transplants, and the artificial hip. In fact, they're probably far healthier than before their respective operations. We could say that they're back to their old selves, because their illnesses had reduced them to invalids. Now they're normal again. But what about Crystal? Crystal is no longer the person she once was. Her body is the same. We recognize her facial features. But her personality has changed. If we had known Sandy, whose brain Crystal now has, we might say she is more like Sandy than Crystal. We still have Crystal with us, but we've also lost her. All the experiences that made Crystal the person she was have now gone. The memories have gone. The values and interests have changed. Crystal truly is a changed person. Now, for the biologist, kidneys, hearts, and hips serve machine-like functions, regardless of their sophistication, or in the case of the heart, its symbolic significance. And it's because of this, they can each be replaced by machines, either on a temporary or a permanent basis. But it's difficult to hold out the same prospect for the brain, not because of our impoverished understanding or our primitive technology, but because of what the brain is. Now, the outlandish picture that I've given you of a brain transplant helps to make the point that I think it's erroneous to regard ourselves as consisting of a brain, various other organs, and an immaterial something that constitutes the real me, whether that be mind or soul. What I am saying is that our brains represent us. They make us what we are, but only in the sense that we also make them what they are. You see, this is nothing like a machine-based model. This is a personal model. And I think this is very much in line with Christian and certain other religious perspectives. Now, of course, this doesn't mean we can do nothing to the brain. It's obvious. It can be operated on to treat hemorrhages and remove blood clots. We can remove tumors. It can be electrically stimulated in a whole host of different ways. Even fetal grafts can be introduced into the brains of patients with Parkinson's disease. And a range of implants is beginning to appear. But as long as the damage isn't too extensive, and depending, of course, on which brain region is affected, the individuals after the operations are clearly the same people as they were before them. But of course, the dangers are obvious, and they remind us that any intrusion into the brain is an intrusion into the center of what we are as physical beings. Now, in developing a personal model of the brain, we need to look, I think, far more closely at the brain itself, and in particular at one of its features, its plasticity, which is the term used by neuroscientists to denote things like flexibility and pliability. And as soon as we do this, we realize that what we are as persons is not laid down once and for all in the genome. Now, it's true that the basic ground plan for an individual's brain is specified in the genome, but the detailed pattern-aptic connections that link its innumerable nerve cells, they are fashioned by a host of influences throughout life. Now, the developmental period of the brain, that means all our brains, it's characterized by an initial overproduction of neurons, when there is massive competition between them, and only about 50% survive into adulthood. Now, the fascinating aspect of this phenomenon is that it is the external environment that has a crucial role in determining which synaptic connections between neurons persist and therefore which neurons survive. For example, the eyes of the newborn must receive visual stimulation from the external world during the early months of life in order to fine-tune the structure of the visual part of the cerebral cortex. I think even more to the point, this stimulation must occur during what are called quite specific critical periods of brain development. In other words, what this is saying is that external inputs have an extensive influence on the developing brain, and they interact with internal drivers to mold the end product that becomes the adult brain and therefore the adult individual. And it's because of this close interrelationship between the developing brain and extrinsic factors that normal development can readily be disrupted. Change to the environment, delays to the arrival of sensory inputs during development. All these and many other things result in a different brain organization from what would have been the case under other conditions. And that's why things like taking alcohol during pregnancy, resulting in the fetal alcohol syndrome, and much, much lower, more obvious things where the fetuses and the individual are affected to some extent intellectually as a result of this. It's just a part of this whole phenomenon. Therefore, numerous influences during development can have devastating consequences for a child's subsequent intelligence and behavior. And of course, the opposite also holds. A stimulating environment, whether or not it's Mozart, I don't know, but a stimulating environment can increase the complexity of neural organization. And that in turn can alter many facets of the behavioral repertoire of the growing individual, which of course is what we all become. It's not surprising then that it is the specific fine-tuning of the synaptic connections in any given brain that contributes substantially to that individual's uniqueness and personhood. This fine-tuning initially occurs over a crucial period from about 6 months gestation to about 2 years postnatal, and then throughout life, as synapses are lost and replaced in all parts of the brain. So the possible variation is well nigh infinite, and the connections are modified in response to all the experiences that constitute our lives as individual people. And so it seems then that what we are as people emerges from this ongoing dialogue between the neural and the genetic material that we inherit. In other words, and also the worlds that we occupy and the worlds that we ourselves construct. And so this sort of extensive plasticity then makes possible the enormous range of human beings' intellectual abilities and spiritual gifts. And I think it's because of these neural capabilities that we can be human persons, epitomized by things like responsibility, creativity, and responsiveness to each other and to God. If you remove neural plasticity, many of the marks of true human personhood disappear. So our biological uniqueness as individuals mirrors, it seems to me, at least this is what I'm suggesting, our theological uniqueness as persons created by God. And I think the relevance of this for us now is that so much of our biological uniqueness stems from the characteristics of our brains, characteristics that in turn emanate from our genetic inheritance, numerous facets of our pre- and postnatal environment, our responses to the worlds that we encounter, the attitudes we display towards our fellow human beings, and what we make of God's revelation to us. And it seems to me that thoughts along these sorts of lines begin to open up potentially exciting areas for cooperation between neuroscientists and theologians. Because what we are beginning to glimpse here is a means of appreciating theological concepts using our understanding of brain function as a guide. And I hope that that's a rich and profitable avenue that people will explore at least sometime. Let me go on now then and talk about neurogenetics. Now, it's against the background of all that I've said so far that we now move on to another very problematic domain, that of the genetic forces at work in making us what we are. Problems here stem from the plethora of genes that apparently determine what makes us the people we are. And in the popular imagination, it's difficult to escape from IQ genes, genes for aggression, gay genes, and even, the latest one, poverty genes. Now, I suppose one could add, and this is me here, one could add to this list religious genes, spirituality genes, genes for prayer, even possibly agnostic genes. The thing, though, the argument is always the same. What the argument is saying is these genes cause us to act in certain ways, and from that there's no escape. Certain genes lead to certain behavior patterns, and some genes lead to disease. And what we are told is there is no escape from that. We are prisoners of our genes. Now, of course, the thing is that there are many repercussions of that. But the message for Christians and for others is a grim one. While such associations have repercussions for many groups of people, the concern of Christians and other religious people is that they undermine central elements within our responsibility as human beings. If I have no choice but to say to be aggressive, I'm unable to respond to the call of Christ to be a peacemaker and to love my neighbor as myself. Of course I can't. I'm aggressive. That's what my genes tell me. It may even be that the fruits of the Spirit can't manifest themselves in my life, not because I'm being unfaithful, but because I'm genetically inclined to be otherwise. Well, how do we respond to these rather unsettling possibilities? Well, the link between individual genes and behavior is far more complex than is ever suggested by the gene for X scenario. And this is due to the presence of multiple genetic factors, the substantial role played by environmental factors, and their interaction with genetic ones. Also, genes are switched on and off in response to a variety of pressures, both during development and later on in cell life. And so, a gene or even a set of genes will rarely be the only cause of any particular condition. The pathway, say, between a gene and an individual scoring highly on, let us say, an IQ test, or having an aggressive personality, is very indirect. This isn't to argue that genes have no influence on behavior. Of course they do. And every development in modern biological science leads us to expect them to. Let me just take quickly one or two examples. The so-called IQ gene is a totally misleading concept with no basis in scientific reality. IQ is influenced by many different genes. If, for the sake of argument, the heritability of IQ is 0.5 in Western populations, and if there are 25 genes associated with this variation, each will be associated with 2% of the observed variation in IQ. Now, that sort of very small effect isn't easily distinguished from chance fluctuation. And a whole series of detailed genetic studies comparing groups of children with substantially different IQs have led to the conclusion that, and I quote one set of workers, some differences in the frequencies of particular alleles at particular loci have been found between high and average IQ groups. But studies like this then open the way to determining how genetic differences may lead to differences in IQ. But that is very far from finding an IQ gene that can be manipulated to increase intelligence. And then a huge amount of attention is devoted to a genetic basis for antisocial behavior, and hence for legal and moral responsibility for criminal behavior. Now, relatively few genetic studies, though, have been done in this area. One study on a particular family with a high incidence of violence and serious crime among its male members, it did claim to find an association. And the focus settled on a gene responsible for producing a protein which is monoamine oxidase A, and that is involved in regulating a neurotransmitter serotonin in the brain. The male members involved in aggressive behavior had low levels of MAOA in their bodies, had lower than average IQ, and had a defect in this particular gene. A subsequent study by other researchers investigated this link in a group of 500 male children. And the data of these workers pointed in the same direction, but only if the individuals concerned had also been mistreated and abused as children. And so what emerges then is that it's probably the interaction between the genetic variant and the environment that is important. And then in a celebrated legal case in the United States, the association of a point mutation in the MAOA gene with antisocial behavior, it was used in the defense of Stephen Mobley, who shot dead a pizza store manager in 1991. Mobley's lawyers requested that he be tested for this genetic abnormality on the grounds that this might explain his actions. However, the defense wasn't accepted, and he was executed in 2005. Another approach in the antisocial area is based on results from mice with targeted disruption of neural nitric oxide synthetase, because these mice are particularly aggressive. And the aggression appears to be associated with decreases in the turnover of serotonin and its receptors in brain regions that regulate emotions. But the same strictures apply here as with neuroimaging. Causality is only inferred from this association, and the complexity of the gene-environment interactions is daunting and leads to the distinct possibility that it may never prove feasible to quantify the contribution of just one or two factors. And of course, making the situation even more difficult is the temporal factor, in the effect of environmental factors on any underlying genetic predisposition. And finally here, before some reflections, I can say very little, of course, about it. What about the gay gene? Now, all this stems from a 1993 study. The study was based on 40 pairs of homosexual brothers with family histories indicating a high rate of homosexuality on the mother's side. And there were significant similarities in the genetic markers in a particular region. It's a region which contains around 100 genes, and that is on the X chromosome. And these workers found that 82% of sibling pairs had shared DNA in this region of the chromosome, significantly above the 50% that one would expect. In a subsequent study, the same group of researchers replicated the results, but in a lower number of homosexual brothers. It was 67% in this case. And then yet another group failed to establish the same genetic linkage. Now, studies like these tend to suggest that this particular region on the X chromosome may contain genes with a role in sexual orientation in males, although the association is less strong than initially proposed. Now, there are, though, real problems with genetic studies on sexual orientation. They tend to suffer from small sample sizes, from the method of recruitment of research subjects, and the definition and measurement of sexual orientation itself. And I think in the last analysis, the most likely conclusion will be that a number of genes are involved, along with a host of environmental and social factors. What then about some reflections? The world of neurogenetics points clearly to the conclusion that aspects of our character and personal identity have a genetic basis. Now, that's hardly a surprising conclusion, because we are our bodies and our bodies are us. Genetic factors are inevitably involved, even at the deepest and some would say the most sacred levels of what makes us the people we are. It seems to me this in no way threatens the conception of a person as a rational being, capable of taking responsibility for ourselves as free agents. Nor does it even hint that we cannot act as God's agents and as his stewards in his created order. After all, to use a biblical expression, we are of the earth. And we recognize that God himself was incarnated to become one with us, to become flesh with, among many other things, its genetic building blocks. But these building blocks, as we've seen, are far from unalterable. what they give rise to is intimately affected by the environment, both the internal environment down to the level of cells and tissues, and of course all of the environmental factors external to our bodies. It's up to us as persons to determine what we do with both our abilities and our restrictions, no matter how obviously genetically based some of these may be. We are to use the resources at our disposal rather than view ourselves as prisoners of our inheritance. The information provided by behavioral genetics should be used to increase our repertoire of understanding so that we can come to terms with the behavioral conundrums with which we are all confronted. In the final analysis, it is we who decide how we live and act, and also what we believe. It's true that for some, this freedom is severely restricted due to either developmental restrictions or later brain injury. But most of us are in a position to play a causal role in how we live and what we do. But, and we must look ahead, will this change in a future world if the genetic makeup of individuals is totally known? Genetic chips might be available, and these could be used to read out our individual genetic makeup. Theoretically, everything that could be known about us genetically would be known. It would just be a matter of reading out and then analyzing our genetic blueprint. Information would be available on the functioning of our kidneys or our brain, the chances of our manifesting a whole range of cancers or heart disease, and even our ability to cope with stress or our proneness to depression. This, of course, is the realm of potential genetic determinism. And some would argue that we would have become prisoners of our genes. We could do nothing but live out what we were predestined to be. On the other hand, even in this extreme situation, genetic determinism wouldn't work out like this, because the multifaceted nature of gene action would still apply. Genes wouldn't act in isolation of innumerable environmental factors. And in the end, it would be up to individuals to decide what they were going to do with the knowledge available to them. A predisposition for a disease or a behavioral trait is not the same as having that disease or expressing that trait. There's a big difference between the two. And I can see that my time is nearly up, and so my last, hopefully very, very provocative section on brain and heart, I think I will largely have to probably skip over. Let me just say, and again, I won't go through all this, but you've got the details there. After all, the thing is that in everything I've said so far, while I've alluded on a number of occasions to the heart, the implication all the way through has been that the brain has greater explanatory power in assessing what it is that makes us human persons. But this may be seen as posing problems for certainly Christian theology, because Christian theology at least is imbued with thinking on the heart and virtually nothing on the brain. Inevitably, this stems from cultural context within which the biblical writers, both Old and New Testament, were operating. But does this have repercussions for contemporary Christians surrounded by the sort of evidence that I've been discussing, but who have a framework that is heart-centered? As I say, I don't have time to go through this, but what you'll find on the notes is that you can go through numerous biblical passages where you have reference to the heart. You will not find any references to the brain. Now, to me, this is fairly obvious in terms of what people knew about the brain at the time. The concern that I have, though, is, are Christians, and probably others today, using a cultural context which is thousands, certainly hundreds, if not thousands of years old, and is that a hindrance to our understanding of our responsibility as people today? I mean, let me just go and just briefly here. Now, it's true that if you look, again, looking in a Christian context here, that Jesus announced that you shall love the Lord your God, this is Mark 12:30, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. What I find people often do is fragment this statement into individual components, as though heart, soul, mind, and strength represent bits of our response. But if we do that, we lose the wholeness and the unity of the human person. Now, one suggestion is that the heart incorporates soul, mind, and strength. It constitutes the overarching framework. And that is, of course, the way we look at the human person. Now, of course, I would argue that soul, mind, and strength are all essentially neural features, which are central to how we act as human beings. And I think one can go through that, and as I say, I don't have time to do it. But let me now just say that my concern is that I think we gain a greater understanding of much of what Jesus was teaching if we think about the brain rather than the heart. We will never do this, though, if we cling to a quasi-dualism in which the brain is seen as the center of our rational being and the heart as the center of our emotional responses to God. Because this misses the unity of what we are as people before God, and it fails to do justice to living as God's people. And I think that, as I say, I haven't had time to deal with it, but I think that digression then into the relationship between the brain and the heart helps us realize that an appreciation of the brain in the 21st century is really very practical, and maybe more so than we've ever thought. And so, finally, I'm bringing things to an end. As embodied individuals, all aspects of our mental functioning, including belief systems, attitudes, prejudices, and predilections, they have neural substrates. This is not unique to the brain, since the functioning of other body systems also has physical and chemical substrates. And I think this constitutes, of course, the basis of traditional medical diagnosis. The degree of sophistication may be quite different, but I don't think there's a difference in principle. It's within this context that we need to recognize that the brain is a particularly vulnerable part of our bodies, damage to which may have immense implications for what we are as persons before God. And so it seems to me that protection of the brain, both ours and other people's, should be recognized as an obligation placed upon all, and especially upon God's people. This protection, of course, takes many forms, from ensuring adequate nutrition before birth to protection from injury and infection after birth. It also entails making available treatment of the brain in its many guises, whether these employ psychopharmaceuticals, psychological therapy, and surgery, all within a therapeutic paradigm. Argued is an intimate one, and it points to the central importance of relationships to human life. We dare not study the brain as though it were an isolated entity. It's an integral part of the individual's body, and through this, with the community to which that individual belongs, both the human community and the religious one. And of course, connected to all this is the psychosomatic unity of people, according to which our brains are influenced by other body systems and by our overall functioning. And nowhere does the two-way relationship between the brain and environment emerge more clearly than here. The other thing I've argued is that plasticity of the brain lies at the core of our personhood, because in its absence we will be unable to learn, to respond to each other, to respond to God, and to exercise our responsibility as those made in the image of God. Unfortunately, this is a concept so foreign to non-neuroscientists that it's overlooked in much theological debate. Its relevance, I think, to genetic discussions is also missed, since any individuals who may be born following genetic or embryonic modification will have brains characterized by a high degree of plasticity and therefore capable of changing and molding their worlds. They will be no more robots or prisoners of their biology than we are. But that, of course, could get us off into cloning and all things like that, which we're not discussing. Okay, and at that point, I'll stop.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Jones, for getting us off to a great start on our brain day. And I hope, again, our brains are fully firing. So we're going to head in the question time. So who would like to be first? On the front row here, and we need the mic. And just a reminder to hold the mic right up to near your mouthpiece when you're asking the question. So, thank you.
Being at Notre Dame, I'm privileged to be around some of the ongoing work of Alvin Plantinga, the leading American philosopher of religion. I think most people would agree. Lately, he has been working on the philosophy of mind and has been taking a look at arguments against substance dualism. He looks at 7 and argues that actually all of them are a failure. I think I disagree with him on how seriously he takes the brain-to-mind correlate argument. I think there's something very interesting there that dualists need to take into account. But it also seems to me that dualists can do that, and given, say, Leibniz's machine argument that machines can't be conscious, and the various theological arguments in favor of dualism involving death and resurrection and that sort of thing, that a chastened, empirically astute dualism deserves more attention than it's gotten. If you had days or weeks to lecture to us rather than hours, would you consider such a view and its merits, or how would you reply to that?
I don't know if you can hear that question at the back. Could you repeat, sort of summarize, please? For the people at the back saying, yeah.
Would you like to put it in one sentence?
Okay. Yes. The question, more briefly, is why not consider a weakened and empirically sensitive modification of substance dualism about human persons, rather than some sort of, maybe non-reductive materialism, or I'm not sure what you're advocating, given that there are philosophical and theological arguments in favor of dualism that you haven't addressed?
I'm coming at this very, very much from the perspective of the neuroscientist, and therefore I'm coming at it quite deliberately from the perspective of the brain, just to see how far that will or won't take us. And in a sense, I don't address these issues quite deliberately because I don't think they're really relevant. Now, I know from the philosophical perspective, they are, obviously very ripe for whole sorts of discussions. But I think coming at it from a neuroscientist, as I have done, I don't see that they are of particular interest to me. Now, because as I look at my own terminology, all the time I ask, well, how much do I ever use the concept of mind? And the answer is, I don't. It doesn't come into my thinking any more than the soul comes into my thinking. They don't come in. And now, whether I am losing anything hugely as a result of that, or whether I'm going off down some great heretical tract, I'm not sure. But they are not really approaches that I find particularly valuable from my perspective as a neuroscientist. So it's completely bypassing your question. It's not saying that it's not a relevant question in certain contexts, but it doesn't seem to be relevant from my angle as a neuroscientist.
I don't necessarily want to claim that it would be, so maybe we don't disagree all that much.
No.
I've got a question about Prozac, which you raised very interestingly, I think. And it seems to me that it's maybe the first port of call in treating essentially what may be a condition that can have a psychological cause. Maybe depression can manifest itself in adult life, but it could be the result of some kind of abuse in childhood, maybe not physical abuse, maybe psychological abuse of some kind, neglect, lack of love, and so on. And we are wholes in a sense, mind-body wholes, but maybe an approach where counseling, where perhaps unlocking what these initial problems were, confronting them, maybe forgiveness, these sorts of more spiritual values brought to bear might also be helpful. I'm not saying necessarily that the two should be exclusive, but it does worry me that people sometimes get put on Prozac for life and with perhaps not altogether happy consequences.
Oh, I agree with you 100%. And I think this is the same with any psychopharmaceutical, any drug which directly affects the brain, you're all the time looking, you should be asking, the trouble with any of these forms of technology is that they can appear to solve certain problems. But of course, they probably aren't solving the problems if there are a whole lot of deep-seated social, personal, whatever the other issues are. And I think simply to put someone on some of these drugs for life without attempting to address these other issues is very much looking at the brain as a machine. It's not looking at the individual as a whole person. Obviously, this argument came up years ago when it was with Valium, etc. It was exactly the same situation. And of course, this is the trouble of the sort of societies in which we live, because they are very, very much, if you like, superficial technological societies. If there appears to be a technological fix, use it. And that then will only possibly, it might do some good, but on the other hand, without addressing the fundamental issues, it may be a huge distraction in the long term. So I would see these very much as short-term allied approaches. But again, you see, that then raises the more general issue, and I know some people are very concerned about this, to what extent should you use approaches which directly influence, manipulate the brain, as opposed to, or in addition to, looking at things which affect the environment and hopefully improve the environment. And very much I would see the both as being essential.
Thank you. Okay, let's go Mr. Vernon, just we have the mic up here and we'll work back this way. So.
Jeffrey Schwartz, a neurobiologist from University of Los Angeles, LA. He has a book, The Mind and the Brain, and he talks a lot about neuroplasticity. And he says, since our ideas can also, our thoughts can change the brain itself, I think he's going to a dualism from there. Do you see any point in that? Like, that's one thing. And the related question is, when you say the brain is not just a machine, or just we are not just tied to our brain as a machine. What do you add to that? Just the environment, if I understand. So we are our brains plus the environment. Is that the right conclusion? Two questions.
Yeah, I was just picking up that first point that you made there. Yeah, I would see what one has got is this two-way interaction. Because when one says the environment affects the brain, it's not just sort of the environment or the pretty, countryside out there. It's me. It's how I act. It's the sort of responses that I have to things. If I go to activity A rather than activity B, and let's say they are morally totally different, the sort of decisions that I am making will then in itself, in turn, affect the brain. I think so often when people talk about the brain in very mechanical terms, it's as though they're talking about a car or a washing machine or whatever it is. And that if you influence that, it must influence me. Therefore, I am a prisoner of my brain. But what I am arguing is that because you have got this two-way interaction, the brain and environment, the environment very much being me and my responses as well, then what you end up with is me also influencing my own brain. That's what I would see then as a personal view of the brain and as a whole sort of individual, a whole person approach to the brain. So it's not just a one-way thing, it's very much a two-way thing. But that's only possible because of the plasticity of the brain.
Yes, still, but it's all material factors. Environment being the condition we're living in, and our brain is a physical entity, so these two material entities are affecting each other, and us is just a combination of these physical things. Is this the conclusion that we should come from your point of view?
Well, I don't think that's everything that we are, but that is a part of the whole thing, certainly, yes. And in a way, you can argue that the sort of brain that I have, or for any one of us, is perhaps rather different than if I had the same genetic background and I was living in a very impoverished situation in a particular African country. And I think in the end, probably that brain that I have is there and now are really quite different because of the circumstances and therefore inevitably the sort of choices you do or don't have to make.
Okay, thank you.
He's saying no now. Okay, so we've headed this to grassroots and then back over that side.
there is some anecdotal evidence that even after kidney transplant, there is some change in personality.
Sorry, can you hold it close to you?
There is some anecdotal evidence that after kidney transplant or transplant of the heart, there is some change in the personality or habits of the patients, like a complete vegetarian turned to be, suppose, meat eaters or alcoholics or things like that. And people talk about cellular memory also in this regard, although it's not very much in the mainstream medical science. Would you like to comment on that aspect? And second question is that we are not prisoners to our biology. I do agree with the spirit of your words, but if biology has got to do something with the nature, it could be paraphrased as we are not prisoners of our nature. Then the question is, with my ignorance in Christian faith and theology, how could Jesus say that one or some of his disciples would betray him when the disciple himself didn't know or aware of it consciously? How could he know something would happen unless we say that person has got the tendency or the nature to do something, unless it was in his nature or in his biology? Do you understand the point? I'm not condemning any person that he is destined to be good or bad or evil, but something is there which makes them inclined or have the tendency to do things, evil or good or whatever. So there is some point, maybe that there is some inclination, we call it nature or prisoners of biology, whatever. Would you like to comment on that?
I'm not sure if I can comment on that latter part. Let me just come to the first part about the transplants. The transplants was that there's some evidence that people who've had kidney transplants, that certain aspects of of their living and were vegetarians now not, or vice versa, or whatever it might be. So other things within them have actually altered. I can't answer that in detail there. I've certainly known someone with, say, a heart transplant, very, very much aware of where that has come from and what he did and didn't know about the individual. In a way, in the end, I think there's a huge amount about all this that we don't understand at the moment, and one is not. While I have said that sort of kidneys, hearts are largely machines, they still are biological machines, and undoubtedly then are influenced in some way by the people of whom they are a part. Of course, too, with the transplants, there is very much the awareness that someone, for most of these anyway, not always kidneys, but someone has died, and I am the recipient of someone's death. And I'm response to this. So one would expect that, whereas perhaps if one was able to replace them with literally technical, I don't think I can really comment on the second part of your question, but we can discuss that afterwards.
Okay, I think we'll just go back to
in relation to, would it be true to say that we can think in terms of emotional intelligence being the heart of our nature, and therefore would correspond to the Christian heart analogy or metaphor?
Can you work that out just a little bit as to what you mean by, or might mean, by emotional intelligence?
The emotional functioning of our brain in relation to emotional attitudes and thinking and relations, as it were, a subset of our thinking which is distinct from what we normally think of the rational intelligence.
I'm not in the end trying to say that the heart has nothing whatsoever to do. I mean, after all, we all use terms like heartbroken, or whatever it might be. I mean, we use these at one level, and I'm not going to try and stop myself every single time I'm about to use one of those terms. And I mean, I think this is just a part of our thinking. The point I'm really trying to make is that, but if one was going to look seriously at what drives the emotions in us, and if biologically you're actually going to try and find a source or whole set of sources for that, it's going to be in the brain. It's not going to be in the heart or the liver or the gut. Now, obviously, in our thinking now, we tend to use heart. We don't use some of the other organs which some of the biblical writers loved, but which is not a part of our culture anymore, you see. I mean, that's really all that I'm saying. And when you get in things like, Galatians, that the importance of the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, etc., and then the opposite, and that there are certain things that it would be good not to speak about, etc., because it will influence detrimentally the whole community of faith. Then it seems to me that if you then say, well, if I go and watch certain films or whatever it might be, that'll actually influence my brain. My brain will be different in some ways as a result of that. So it's not just setting up a dictum which says one shouldn't do this or that. It is trying to give a reason to say that if you do this, you are then getting influenced. Your brain's getting influenced, you as a person are getting influenced, and you're influenced in a way which has got, say, if you like, a clear fingerprint in your brain because you have done certain things or watched something or whatever it might be. And I think what I'm trying to do is to tie together and say, yes, it does have an influence because it's influencing our brains and what we are as real people.
Okay, so we'll come over to here, and then we're going to go to the back row right after you. So,
hello, thank you for a very stimulating presentation. My question is one which comes really from almost what I detect as a slight degree of frustration at our theological friends. And so I'd like you to comment. Why is it, I'll be quite controversial and say, why is it that our theological friends don't seem up to the job? I mean, I've noticed that for some time, that they just aren't up to the job. And is it because of the weight of tradition, the weight of language, the fact they're paid by the church or whatever it is, and therefore, in a sense, they can't say anything even if they thought it? They just aren't up to the job. What would you say?
Well, probably some of them would say that I'm not up to the job either. It's, well,
theologians are just not up to the job.
one of these things about the heart and brain which actually started me thinking about this, quite apart from the preachers I hear who are always talking about the heart over here. And I think, actually, another thing I noticed, this is completely incidental, is so many of the modern songs, quite apart from being musically illiterate, they are allegedly contemporary, but they are using very traditional concepts, terribly traditional concepts. You've got soul, heart all over the place. Now, so what does some of this mean? Anyway, that's by the way. But just over a year ago, when it was in the UK, I was at a small colloquium, and I'd given something which wasn't the same as this, but it had just in passing, it had mentioned about the heart as being just a pump. I mean, there was just a couple of words, literally in passing, because I was talking about the brain, of course. It was a neuroscience talk. And a particular theologian, who I believe is reasonably well known in Anglican circles in the UK, as a serious theologian, he was really irate at me that I should have so downplayed the heart because it is so central to Christian thinking. And I have to say, I was just so taken aback by this that I hadn't expected it. And I felt was, well, certainly missing the point of what I was saying. But, but I picked it up, though, clearly as being something of major significance from his perspective. I'm not downplaying that one iota. I think it was a huge perspective. And I suddenly realized we're in different worlds. And I don't feel easy or comfortable with this.
If I'd be just like to comment on that, I mean, I've been a preacher for 40 years. I did preach a sermon in which I brought in about the brain, because I explained about the effect on children at early age, and the importance there for the church to be involved with children, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that got the most positive response of any sermon that I've done. Indeed, I was asked to publish it, which it did get published. We must not underestimate the what shall I say, the desire of the ordinary Christian person to want to be helped in these areas. And I do think our theologians are badly letting down not just the interface between, you know, religion and science, but ordinary people, by hanging on to these ideas which, for various reasons, and it's almost like a selfish desire to keep going down the same hole you're in, because it keeps your career going. Now, they won't like you saying this, but I do think our theologians are seriously letting down the side, and they are just not up to the job, honestly.
Okay, I think we're going to go to the back, because Paul's been waiting patiently right at the back there. If we can pass the mic to the back row, please, and then we'll come back up that row again.
I have two questions. One is to do with this whole idea that my genes made me do it. There has been, as you said, the court case about, you know, trying to get a study of this person's genes. I was wondering if, on the other hand, has there been studies on gene therapy and how that has reformed people, how that has helped people come out of, you know, what they've been locked into, so to speak. That's one question. The other,
I'll just pick up that. Well, obviously, gene therapy is nowhere near advanced. I mean, it's still in incredibly primitive, you know, experimental stages. So, in a sense, you can't answer that particular question. But I suppose you can answer the question in terms of various other forms of therapy, not just genetic, but other forms of therapy, various psychotherapy, whatever it might be, and various other probably forms of medical treatment where clearly someone has got something fairly basically wrong, whether it's genetic, probably genetic, whatever, and obviously then one does something which helps them in their situation. So, I mean, that, would, of course, would be very much a part of many aspects of normal medical practice. So one's very much, you know, very conversant with that, but not the gene therapy as such.
the second question deals with your emphasis on the environment and the choice that that gives for the individual to choose either the straight and narrow, the broad and, you know, and, or the straight and narrow. But then that presupposes the idea that environment gives us a free choice. To a certain extent, and for the large majority of the world's people, environment is not a free choice.
Sure.
It is itself an imposed choice, and in many cases, it produces great strictures on people and reduces the choice enormously.
Absolutely.
So much so doesn't even give people choice.
No.
So this reliance on environment as being the a sort of a way forward to bring in free will and so on. I'm wondering how far can we take?
Oh, no, I wouldn't take it anything like as far as that. I mean, we're aware that the tragedy of the sort of world in which we live is that so many people essentially have no choice. If you live a bare subsistence existence, quite apart from the wars and things going on, then you have very little choice as to what you can do, as opposed to survive and try to help a few others around you and your family. No, so I'm not trying to bring in free will or anything. Or what I'm saying is, though, is simply, I suppose, arguing against the inevitability of being a certain sort of person just because we have a certain genetic constitution, or our brain is as it is, or whatever. So I'm only arguing in that way, and not making it any stronger than that at all.
Okay, we've got time for just one more question. It's going to Peter here on the second row. So,
could you comment on the distinction or diagnosis of the difference between a spiritual disorder leading perhaps to mental problems and a biochemical disorder leading to very similar problems, and perhaps the tendency in some circles to use exorcism or something like that rather than a medical treatment? Because obviously in some circles, depression is seen as a spiritual problem, not necessarily a physical problem.
The honest answer is that no, I really can't answer that. No, but I think, I mean, like many of these other things, though, I would be unhappy in making that sort of sharp distinction between a spiritual problem and a medical problem. While I think the balance between the two can be huge. I mean, I don't know whether you've got a continuum there. So on the one, at one end of the continuum, you have got what one might largely see as some spiritual disorder. At the other end of the continuum, something which is quite clearly a clinical disorder. So I think I would see it as a continuum, and with the spiritual side of things often influencing the other. Now, of course, then different people interpret these in different ways. So if one says that any mental aberration must be spiritual, then quite clearly you've cut out the possibility of a biochemical or whatever type of base for it. And I would be unhappy with that. On the other hand, I would also be unhappy saying, well, it can only be biochemical and it cannot have a spiritual component. Clearly, I would see very much there the possibility of a spiritual component. So I think it's the continuum, but also the interpretation we place on that. And to me, that there should be an openness to a spiritual interpretation more than a biochemical, or vice versa, depending on the actual evidence in front of you. I mean, that's the way I would see it.
Okay, we're going to break now for coffee and tea. Before we do that, let's just thank Professor Jones very much.